which meant basically that we just started to discuss general purpose AI, foundation model, Gen AI chapter. We had the very first brainstorming or second brainstorming on the table, and suddenly the political hierarchy told us, well, you need to stop now. It's done, it's a done deal.
Welcome, everyone, to the AI Governance Podcast, where we discuss practical approaches for responsible AI practitioners. My name is Var Shankar, and today we'll be talking about the EU AI Act, which has now been published and will come into effect in August, just 2 weeks from now. Our guest today is Kai Zenner, who is the head of office and digital policy advisor for Axel Voss in the European Parliament. Kai knows the EU AI Act better than anyone, so we're really excited for this conversation with him. Kai, good to see you again, and welcome.
Many thanks for the invitation.
Great. So, since the AI Act has been published and it'll come into force next month, we've known for some time what it might look like. You've been up close and watched the European political process play out over the past few years, with major changes being made to the draft text in response to AI developments. So I'd love your take on what major lessons policymakers in the US, UK, and around the world could learn from the EU experience.
Yeah, I think, first of all, and this we in the European Union did wrong, in my humble opinion. There was such a time pressure to close the AI Act negotiations at the end of last year in front of the Christmas break, because this was said that it was basically the last option in order to get out the European AI Act in front of the European elections that took place this year in June, which meant basically that we just started to discuss general purpose AI, foundation model, Gen AI chapter. We had the very first brainstorming or second brainstorming on the table, and suddenly the political hierarchy told us, well, you need to stop now. It's done, it's a done deal. And for us on technical level, this was an almost hurting situation, because we knew that this text is really not up to speed yet, that many points remained very vague, and so on and so on. So this would be my first advice: to really take your time to figure out what to do, what is right, look for evidence. Make sure that, for example, the risk categories, if you are also using a risk-based approach like the European AI Act, are really reflecting reality. In the AI Act, there are certain prohibited use cases or high-risk use cases that are not in use. No one is developing AI systems in this direction. And then the question is, why are they in the European AI Act? The second point, besides this time pressure, is, I think, to focus on very general, almost ethical rules for artificial intelligence, so similar to the AI Bills of Rights from the United States, in order to have really a framework that is applicable to all different sectors, to all different use cases. But in order to do so, of course, it needs to remain general. And then probably the best advice is to complement those general principles with sectorial legislation. You see already where I'm going through. It's not so much the European AI Act, but more the US and the UK approach, because as a lawyer, I think it's the better direction, because having one horizontal law that is applicable for every AI system out there, in my eyes, is just problematic. And then the third and final point, I would say, is especially AI, and you said it already, it's such a dynamic and fast moving area, requires constant stakeholder exchanges. So what countries should do is to really build up some mechanisms, some fora, and so on, where there is a balanced representation from companies, upstream, downstream, from civil society and academics, in order to have this constant and regular conversation on the latest developments on AI, because we as regulator will probably miss a lot of new incidents, new yeah, technological developments and so on. And without those fora, maybe then the law will not be really up to date or comprehensive. If you do all three things, then I think you are on a very good road, let's say, to make a working and functional AI regulation.
Thanks, Kai. And I know that you've written in the Financial Times on this topic today. So I'd encourage our listeners to take a look at that article as well. So take the advice for policymakers is take your time, focus on general ethical rules for AI, and then take stakeholder engagement seriously.
Yeah.
So the AI Act draws a distinction between AI and general purpose AI. So despite different regulatory regimes in the US and in the EU, this is kind of an area of agreement that general purpose AI is something different that poses potentially different kinds of risks. And we see efforts like the Hiroshima process, discussion of general purpose AI in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. Is this an area where we might see clear, ongoing, and consistent guidance from regulators, at least in advanced democracies?
Yeah. No, I think actually in general, we are rather lucky, let's say, in the field of AI when it comes to international cooperation. Because if you look to the war in Ukraine or Israel against Palestine, or let's say climate actions and so on, basically countries cannot really agree on a common line. There are often even more than two camps and so on. And I would even say that non-democratic actors on AI share often, at least let's say, the policy directions that the European Union, the US, and so on agreed upon. For example, the OECD 2019 principles on artificial intelligence have been adopted by G20, so also China, also India, and so on. So in general, already in AI, I would say we are on a good path, because there is so far at least a lot of international cooperation. On Gen AI, indeed, especially between the United States and the European Union, from the beginning, there was a lot of exchanges, especially taking place in the TTC framework between our two regions. Unfortunately, by the way, these TTC discussions were often not transmitted, or the outcome was not transmitted to us that was developing the AI Act. So we often only knew from the press what the governments or the European Commission was discussing there. But indeed, it helped that, for example, the thresholds 1025 or 1026 VLOPs, flops, flops were similar, and also other approaches when it comes to Gen AI regulation or Gen AI policy was rather similar, and again based on the same key principles. And after the AI Act negotiations have been concluded, I know that the European Commission, based on those conclusions in the AI Act, was even more enforcing and accelerating the discussions with our US American friends in order to get some alignments, and back to the OECD or to the WEF or United Nations, also on those international fora, there are discussions. And I think this will help us a lot, because in the end, for companies, for example, developing a foundation model here in the European Union, will have it, of course, then also easier to sell this model to clients in the United States, in Canada. But also when it comes to security, all those discussions about building up common research projects on Gen AI, um, building up maybe a kind of CERN for AI or a similar framework like for biological research or research on viruses. All of that, I think, is very promising and very much needed. So here I'm rather optimistic, I would say.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you about the that we've been lucky in the international cooperation. It's been a major area of concern for civil society and for academia that there's kind of a regulatory gap between the pace at which especially generative AI systems have been advancing and the pace of kind of lawmakers' responses. And I know that one of your suggestions was to take your time. I think that's very wise. But at the same time, it's good to see kind of responsive international, at least common positions on generative AI.
Yeah.
So of course, lawmaking is political. So we end up with legal requirements that overlap to varying degrees with privacy, cybersecurity, sector-specific requirements. And in some cases, they might even contradict some of those requirements. With regard to the AI Act, how do you expect this complexity to be reduced over time? Or do you expect this complexity to be reduced over time?
Well, hopefully, but it is indeed, as you indicated, a major exercise. And maybe to go back a little bit to my first statement on what are the lessons learned for other regions. Again, this time pressure led to a lot of overlaps and contradictions within the AI Act already, but also and especially when it comes to the relationship between the AI Act and, for example, DSA, Digital Services Act, GDPR or Data Protection Law, Platform Work Directive, political advertisement regulation, and so on and so on and so on. Also, a lot of sectorial legislation, finance sector, medical device regulation, and so on. There were already similar rules that were addressing artificial intelligence, maybe sometimes in a different way. But now the AI Act, as a horizontal AI legislation that should cover every AI system out there, is now kind of going in front as a lex specialis, so as a law that is basically the decisive one in an area of contradiction. However, sectors can now always say, yeah, this is a general law, but we are now saying something for the sectors. So it should be us basically that are having the last word now in legal terms. But my last example was already speaking like an actor, and this is indeed the same as the second problem, that there are not only legal overlaps, but also enforcement or governance overlaps, because a lot of our enforcement bodies are already looking into artificial intelligence. For example, the European Central Bank or the EBA, it's a financial agency that are looking for many years in financial services and AI. And now the big question is how all those new market surveillance authorities in the member states and the European AI office in the Commission basically will deal with all those existing enforcement bodies. So it's a huge question mark. And one of the reasons beside the time pressure is, I think, rather typical, especially for democratic systems, that you have a lot of decision makers in the parliament, but also in administration, in the commission, and so on, that are not necessarily willing to cooperate. And sometimes there's a lot of competition between them. Sometimes they don't even know that another unit or another department is also working on AI. And this leads to, as you said, in such a complex topic as AI, combined with a very political, sometimes messy process, it leads naturally almost to a lot of contradictions and overlaps. Yeah, and going back to my first sentence, hopefully in the next years, the European Union will manage to solve the most important ones. What we see now already coming is a lot of secondary legislation, for example, providing a template on copyright protected content, where in the future companies like OpenAI need to provide a summary, a detailed summary about the content being used. And because there are very, very important norms in other laws on exactly this topic, most important, the copyright directive, um, in this template, there will be some sentences how now the AI Act and the established and already applicable copyright directive will play together. What you need to do in order to comply both of them. And this we now basically need to do not only for copyright, but for all those other topics that AI is playing a part.
And so you're optimistic. Let's see how
Yeah,
that plays out.
it will keep us busy. This is for sure.
Great. So beyond generative AI, an area that we see a lot of lawmaker attention on is biometrics. Biometric authentication using fingerprints and voices has made remote commerce much easier. But of course, it's subject to all kinds of risks, from identity theft to privacy violations to discrimination. The treatment in the AI Act is that some biometric use cases are banned. Some, like emotion recognition systems, have additional transparency obligations. And then high-risk biometric use cases may require an external conformity assessment, which is a higher bar than the kind of internal assessment
Yeah.
that might be good enough for other high-risk use cases. Where should practitioners look for best practices when they're using biometrics, especially in remote commerce?
It's an extremely tricky question. Maybe first of all, now really speaking in my personal capacities, I think here the AI Act made good choice and is striking, I think, a good balance between promoting innovation, allowing the use of AI systems in this field of biometrical data, but at the same time, really adding some safeguards because, as you said, this is such a risky field where basically you can do a lot of nasty things, to say it simple, if those data is falling in the wrong hands. So this, I would say, as a general assessment of those new rules. Where it becomes tricky, and this is now a little bit related to the questions that you previously asked on overlaps, is that especially in the European Union, we have already legislation on that topic. And now I'm mentioning two laws that are, I would say, at the forefront: the GDPR, data protection, but then also the law enforcement directive, so which is basically covering all biometrical data deployments cases for law enforcement agencies. And and this will be the first tricky question: how now, if you are active in this field, how the AI Act is dealing with those existing laws, if there are now um, additional points that you need to fulfill as company, or if you are already fine if you are providing a GDPR compliant product, for example. This no one can answer right now. I will talk shortly about it, what it means for the future, but maybe as a first advice for companies that are looking for best practices in this field of biometrics is to look in data protection, in the field of data protection, because I think, especially in Europe and especially in Germany, where the interpretation is very strict, that if you are providing AI biometrical service or product that is fully compliant with the AI Act, I think in most cases you will be fine also, sorry, with the GDPR. In most cases, you will also be fine with your compliance in the AI Act. So as a company, I would really look for best practices from data protection and so on and so on. Plus, on the 1st February 2025, the European Commission will provide guidelines on Article 5, where they are basically, probably creating a kind of use case list, a kind of whitelisting, where they are singling out certain use cases that could, if you read it very strictly, fall under a prohibition in Article 5, but that are so useful for our society, for our personal lives, that they shouldn't be prohibited. They should, for example, only be high risk and so on. And those guidelines will then probably make it even more clear, if the Commission is doing a good job, what you can do and what you should look into it if, as a company, you are interested in this field. And the final guidelines or that are connected to biometrics will be presented. Now I need to calculate on the 2nd February 2026, when the Commission, so 1 year later, when the Commission will provide guidelines on high-risk AI systems. And then, similar to prohibitions, you will very likely see a list of high risk and non-high risk use cases. And with all three things together, I think companies, at least in 2026, will have a very good overview what they should do, what they should not do. Where I'm worried is in this time, especially until February next year, where it's really not clear at all. And I know companies want certainty for investments, but right now, expect maybe you find a good best practice from GDPR, you have almost no certainty in this field.
Yeah, that's really helpful guidance, and it sounds like everyone's going to be both on the practitioner side and on the regulator side is going to be very busy, leading up to these timelines. So European lawmakers have assigned to Sensenelec the task of drawing up standards for compliance to a certain extent with the Act. And we're increasingly hearing from commentators that the standards might not be ready in time. And I'm talking, for example, about the August 2026 timeframe for provisions becoming active for Annex 3 high-risk systems. How can companies prepare to align with standards that may not even be ready by the effective date? Is there somewhere else they can look? Can they look to, for example, ISO standards, IEEE standards, or anywhere else?
Yeah, it's a tough question. First of all, I heard the same, and when I'm speaking to Sensenelec people, they are saying best outcome is finalization of all AI X standards in JTC 21, which is a standardization group in Sensenelec, in July 2026, which would already be bad because companies, as you said, would need to be fully compliant on the 2nd of October, 2nd of August, which basically would give them 1 day. So yeah, it's a really tricky question. First of all, one big issue that we have right now in Sensenelec is that large companies like Microsoft, IBM, and so on, that have already their own AI principles and a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise, they are extremely active. They should be active. It's good for them. And I think to a certain extent, it's also good for the European Union because of all their knowledge. But what we are hearing is that basically most European companies, and even the big ones, are not really active. They are not, so they are just attending but never saying something in those meetings, or they are not even attending. So in the end, those standards could become rather one-sided from certain technology companies, or only looking in certain sectors. And due to the fact that the AI Act wants to be a horizontal law that, of course, would require horizontal standards, this, of course, could become a major headache on top of the time problems that I also mentioned. So to the second part of your question, what companies can basically do now? Yeah, again, they can look to best practices that are already existing. So if you are doing, for example, something on AI that has some, at least some relationship to the finance sector, to the health sector, and so on, there are already a lot of best practices where you can have a look. For example, if we are talking about the quality management system, again, in the health sector, there are a lot of good examples. Especially on the quality management system, there is indeed an ISO standard that is there for many, many years. And so far, I heard quite good feedback. Then, of course, if there is nothing from the European Union, you can probably, or you are doing the best thing you can if you are then at least implementing the ISO standard, or you are designing your product based on the ISO standard, because this gives you already a little bit of certainty and probably puts you already very close to the final outcome of the Sensenelec discussions. The best strategy, however, if you have capacities based on everything I have said, is to become active in Sensenelec, because then you have the chance to really shape how the final standards are looking like. And as I said, Sensenelec is really looking for more active participation of smaller market players, but also especially of European players.
Yeah, and this, this kind of echoes the earlier point about stakeholder engagement, right? Who's in
Indeed.
the room? Who's influencing standards development? We want to make sure it's as representative a group as we can have. All kinds of organizations, all kinds of backgrounds.
Indeed.
But yeah, really appreciate that guidance. So there are so many permutations of how companies can collaborate on AI systems. And in the AI Act, of course, there's companies are kind of playing the role of a provider, a deployer, or another kind of covered role regarding a specific AI system. Just given the many different permutations of how companies collaborate, is there a kind of rule of thumb or simple way to think about which bucket a company might fall into with regard to a specific system?
I can always start in the same way. It's difficult. It's unclear because this is basically, yeah, the standard answer or reply on most of the questions right now in the AI Act, because as I underlined so many times now, it's so heavily depending on secondary legislation, guidelines, templates, standards, delegated acts, implementing acts that hopefully in the future will make those very vague obligations a little bit clearer. On your particular question now, the AI Act, and there's the European Parliament and me personally, were quite engaged in order to make sure that in most cases there should be only one provider. There should be not cases where it's completely unclear and maybe stretched among 10 players who is doing what and so on. But on top of that, and let's say rather strict separation, this actor is the provider, this actor is the deployer, and so on. There is this article 25 on responsibilities along the value chain that is basically also in this whole chapter that is talking about importer, that is talking about a distributor, and so on and so on. And this article 25 is trying to make sure what is happening, for example, if a deployer is using an AI system that he got from, let's say, Cisco, but kind of creating a substantial modification by really changing the use case or adding certain capacities, functionalities in the system. It would be kind of unfair if now Cisco would need to fulfill still all the obligations as provider of a high-risk system. So Article 25 is making clear that in this case, the new company that made those substantial modifications would need to fulfill basically everything that Cisco needs to do before. How this is looking like now in practice, again, depends on further guidelines from the Commission. They will do a guideline what substantial modification is. If, for example, already a rather minor data training could qualify in certain cases as substantial modification. And even though it's not in the law, they probably need to also further specify what a deployer is, because you mentioned it, it's maybe not always so clear. Especially there are some cases where you are using an AI system maybe just for internal purposes. This AI system is not coming into contact with your customers, maybe not even with your co-workers and so on. Is this then maybe falling under the research exemption? Is this maybe an unwritten use case that is not making you a deployer because you are not fulfilling the definition that is in Article 3 of a deployer? There's always the use case of private use, maybe especially interesting for startups or for student groups that are working on something that then is being used or is being put in use and later on also deployed. Are those groups really becoming a deployer? There's the open source exemption that is further complicating it. So there are a lot of question marks, and let's say the AI Act had this vision of using a product safety legislation approach where normally it's very, very clear who is doing what and who is having which responsibility. But now to not always blame the European Commission, but also to blame us as Parliament, we, especially in the Parliament, added a lot of layers because we were thinking otherwise it's not comprehensive enough. But by adding all those different layers, we made it very, very, very tricky in all cases where it's not simple that company A is the provider, company B is the deployer, and person X is the affected end user, for example. It's not so clear anymore. And my standard my standard answer is therefore, as I said already, it's all depending on additional secondary legislation.
Well, really appreciate those keen insights on such thorny topics. And I know we're coming up on time here, but I'd like to cover one more topic. So we talk a lot about companies and regulators. How can individuals kind of play a role in shaping, AI laws, AI standards, AI best practices, and really just kind of lending or contributing their voice to a positive vision of AI?
Yeah. In the AI Act, and it's another positive point, there are a lot of new mechanisms like the advisory forum, like the scientific panel, but also those possibilities to directly exchange with the European Commission / AI office, for example, when it's about guidelines on prohibitions, when it's about templates on copyright protected content. In the future, either via those new mechanisms like the advisory forum or bilaterally, stakeholders are incentivized to reach out, to share best practices, to help the Commission, but also the national enforcement bodies to to be ready, to be aware what is out there, what are the necessities, and so on and so on. We all hope that stakeholders are making use of it, and because they were always demanding it. But we know, of course, resources are maybe sometimes a big problem. Maybe especially a startup is not having a policy department, or they don't have the financial means to fly from Greece regularly to Brussels, to Belgium, and so on and so on. So despite or on top of those, let's say, regulatory improvements that we added in the AI Act, there is indeed a huge need for financial support. Hopefully, and we see it now, there was, for example, a call from the European Commission for an SME representative that is being sent to Senelec meetings, standardization, and similar things could take place where member states or on a European level, the Commission is investing in some areas and particularly focusing on smaller market players or civil society and academics, and allowing them to participate in all those exercises that I have mentioned, especially with the focus on standardization and secondary legislation. And on top of that, we all have this hope that the regulatory sandboxes that we put in the AI Act, that in the future will very likely be complementary to the already existing digital innovation hubs, could play a major role because, let's say the most or the one of the biggest hubs is in London, so now outside of the European Union. Another one is in Berlin, where a lot of startups are coming together and are helping each other, because one is then saying, look, I found a really good solution on quality management systems. Have a look. Maybe you can also use it, and in return, they are learning things about technical documentation. There are AI trainers and other actors in those regulatory sandboxes or standardization hubs or innovation hubs that are basically helping, especially smaller market players to figure out how to become easier and cheaper compliant with the legislation. And I mentioned now civil society. Also, those players are normally involved in those hubs and have a possibility to have a look, to get in contact. And this new form of public-private partnership, I think, has a lot of potential, but it all will depend on finance. So if member states are not financing those new tools, then of course they will not help. So also here, unfortunately, a question mark, but not regulatory wise, but financially wise.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Kai. I know I speak for our listeners when I say thanks so much for joining us today and covering so much ground. We really appreciate your time and insights.